A rejected dog at auction is bought by a young man, and what happens next moves everyone. Part 2, Unbroken Spirits: Shadow's Legacy. This story takes place over approximately 5 years following the initial establishment of Second Chance K9 Rehabilitation Center. The growl came first, low and dangerous, a sound Ethan Walker hadn't heard from Shadow in over 2 years. He turned to see the German Shepherd's hackles raised, body coiled like a spring as he positioned himself between 10-year-old Lily Matthews and the approaching stranger. In that moment, Shadow wasn't standing in a Montana schoolyard. He was back on the battlefield, protecting the vulnerable just as he'd been trained to do. "Shadow, hold," Ethan commanded softly, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The dog didn't attack, but neither did he back down. Something about this man had triggered Shadow's military instincts, and Ethan had learned to trust them. 300 miles away, a gavel slammed down in a federal courthouse. The military has filed a petition for the immediate seizure and return of military asset K9 7421, known colloquially as Shadow, the judge announced. This court will hear arguments next week on whether Mr. Walker's adoption was legal or if the dog remains government property. And in a black SUV parked outside the perimeter of the Second Chance K9 Rehabilitation Center, a figure in military dress blues watched through binoculars as veterans and their dogs moved through their healing routines. He picked up a secure phone. "Sir, we have a problem." Walker isn't just rehabilitating the dog, he's remembering. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The morning ritual at Ethan Walker's ranch hadn't changed much in the 3 years since he and Shadow had exposed Major Harrison's abusive training program. Each dawn, they walked the property's perimeter, Ethan with his coffee, Shadow alert but relaxed. The German Shepherd's coat now gleamed with health, the old scars visible only if you knew where to look. At 47, Ethan's own scars were less visible, but just as permanent nightmares still came, though less frequently now. The difference was that neither of them faced those demons alone anymore. "Looking good today," old friend Ethan murmured as Shadow inspected a fence line. The dog glanced back with what Ethan swore was a smile. Their silent communication had deepened beyond what most could understand, two warriors who had found peace in each other's damaged souls. The Second Chance K9 Rehabilitation Center had grown from Ethan's barn to a 5-acre facility with custom-built kennels, training areas, and a small medical clinic where Dr. Claire Thompson now worked full-time. Sarah Baker had become the center's administration director, channeling her grief for her late husband into ensuring other military dogs received the second chances Shadow had been given. But not everyone in the community embraced their expanding mission. Rebecca Collins, principal of Riverdale Elementary and mother of 2, had been vocally opposed since day one. "Military dogs with PTSD around our children? It's an accident waiting to happen," she'd argued at town meetings. Her husband, a county commissioner, had been pushing for stricter regulations that would effectively shut down the center. More surprising was the recent appearance of General Andrew Matthews, who had arrived from Washington with promises of military support and recognition. "What you're doing here is revolutionary, Walker," he'd said during his inspection tour last month. "The Pentagon is finally ready to acknowledge past mistakes." Ethan wanted to believe him, but something in the general's too-perfect smile made Shadow uneasy. The most unexpected development had come just last week, a brief email from Daniel Parker, the son Ethan hadn't seen since before his final deployment 14 years ago. "Saw you on the news. Thinking of visiting." 7 words that had reopened wounds Ethan thought long scarred over. Each day brought new dogs, broken, traumatized, aggressive, and each success story strengthened Ethan's conviction that what they were building mattered. He couldn't know that everything they'd worked for was about to be threatened from all sides. The Riverdale Community Center buzzed with tension as Rebecca Collins took the podium, her voice carrying through the packed room. 3 days ago, 8-year-old Tommy Wilson was bitten less than a mile from the Second Chance facility. This is exactly what many of us have feared since these dangerous military animals began arriving in our community. She gestured to the bandaged boy sitting with his parents in the front row. "How many more children need to be hurt before we take action?" Ethan stood at the back, Shadow at his side. The room felt airless. He knew Tommy's injury had nothing to do with his dogs. It had been a stray that animal control had already captured, but facts weren't driving this meeting. Fear was. The Second Chance program follows strict safety protocols, Ethan stated when given his turn to speak. Our dogs are never unsupervised. They undergo extensive rehabilitation before any public interaction. What happened to Tommy was tragic but unrelated to our program. Sheriff Davidson nodded in agreement. The animal that bit Tommy had no connection to the rehabilitation center. It was a malnourished stray. But Rebecca wasn't finished. Maybe this particular incident wasn't connected, but it highlights the risk. These are not normal pets. They're trained military weapons with trauma histories. They don't belong near our schools and homes. As the debate heated up, James Cooper, now using a wheelchair but still formidable, wheeled to the front. I served 42 years with military dogs just like these. What Ethan Walker is doing isn't just helping animals, it's honoring the sacrifice of every handler and dog who served this country. This town should be proud, not afraid. The meeting ended in stalemate, with the town council promising to review safety measures before their next session. But the seed of fear had been planted, and Ethan felt the community's once solid support beginning to fracture. The legal notice arrived the following morning via certified mail. Shadow watched from his spot near the kitchen window as Ethan's face darkened reading it. "They're saying you're still military property," Ethan explained, his voice tight. "Harrison's lawyers claim your adoption was never properly processed through military channels, that you were illegally diverted from the proper retirement protocols." He knelt beside Shadow, who pushed his head against Ethan's chest. "Don't worry, buddy, they're not taking you anywhere." Sarah arrived an hour later, her legal background proving invaluable as she reviewed the documents. "This is Harrison written all over it," she concluded. "He's out on bail pending his trial, and he's using his connections to hit back at the two key witnesses against him, you and Shadow." "Can he actually win this?" Ethan asked, pacing the kitchen while Shadow tracked his movements. "Technically, military working dogs are classified as equipment. Recent legislation has improved their status, but there are still gray areas." Sarah's expression hardened. "But we have public opinion, evidence of Harrison's misconduct, and a solid adoption paper trail. We'll fight this." That night, a package arrived without return address or postmark, just a weathered cardboard box left on the porch. Inside was Lieutenant Michael Baker's personal journal, still smelling faintly of Afghanistan dust. A yellow post-it note simply read, "He would want you to have this. It explains everything." Shadow's reaction to the journal was immediate and surprising. He approached it cautiously, sniffed it thoroughly, then lay down beside it with a soft whine, a sound of recognition. Under the glow of his desk lamp, Ethan began reading Baker's meticulous entries. 3 hours later, his coffee cold and forgotten, he sat back in shock. The journal detailed not just Harrison's abuse of the dogs, but something Ethan had never known: Shadow's pivotal role in a classified operation code named Desert Shield, the very mission where Ethan's own unit had nearly been wiped out. "You were there," Ethan whispered, looking at Shadow with new understanding. "You tried to warn them." The German shepherd met his gaze steadily, as if acknowledging a truth too long buried. Their connection ran deeper than he had ever imagined. Lieutenant Baker's journal entries grew increasingly detailed as Ethan read into the night. The leather-bound pages documented Shadow's exceptional performance during Operation Desert Shield, the same operation where Ethan's unit had been ambushed in the mountains of Kandahar. Baker's entry from April 17, 2011 made Ethan's hands shake. "K9 Rex Shadow detected something today that his handler ignored. The dog kept pulling northeast away from our planned route. Harrison's new training protocols dictate handler dominances, so Williams forced the dog to comply. 2 hours later, we walked into heavy fire. Lost Rodriguez and Jenkins before we could establish position. Second squad reported a German shepherd broke away from handler control and ran directly to their position moments before the attack, displaying clear alerting behavior. If Williams had listened to his dog, we might have avoided the ambush entirely. K9 Rex somehow sensed Sergeant Walker's unit was in danger. This wasn't standard protocol, this was something deeper." Ethan remembered that day with painful clarity, the sudden appearance of a military dog without a handler, the way it had barked and circled before the first shots rang out. Their captain had ordered them to change position based on the dog's behavior, saving at least half the unit. Ethan had been wounded, but survived. He'd never known which K9 unit had inadvertently warned them. "It was you," Ethan whispered, looking at Shadow, who lay at his feet. You tried to save both units. The realization struck him with physical force. Their paths had crossed years before the auction house. Shadow had saved his life long before Ethan had saved Shadow's. The following morning, Ethan brought the journal to Sarah and Dr. Thompson. "This changes everything," Sarah said, carefully photographing each page. "It proves Harrison's methods were directly responsible for combat casualties, and it establishes a prior connection between you and Shadow that strengthens our case against the military reclaiming him." News of the town meeting and the legal challenge spread quickly through Riverdale. By noon, the local diner had become an unofficial debate hall. Sheriff Davidson reported to Ethan that the town was splitting into factions, those who supported the rehabilitation center and those who feared it. "Martha at the grocery store has a petition going to support you," the sheriff explained over coffee, "but the Collinses have their own petition to relocate your facility outside the county limits. People are taking sides, Ethan." Dr. Thompson faced hostility for the first time when picking up supplies at the pharmacy. "The pharmacist asked if I was still treating those killer dogs," she reported, her voice tight with anger. 3 years of successful rehabilitations, and one unrelated incident erases all our credibility. James Cooper organized the veterans in town to form a visible presence at the rehabilitation center. "Strength in numbers," the old handler insisted. "They need to see that military community stands behind these dogs." Even Mark Wilson, the feed store owner who had been one of Shadow's earliest supporters, reported uncomfortable conversations. "Some folks are saying those dogs are damaged goods beyond saving. I told them they were talking about America's heroes, same as any soldier, but fear makes people deaf sometimes." The division cut through friendships and families. At the local school, children of veterans defended the program, while others repeated their parents' concerns. The newspaper's opinion page filled daily with letters from both sides. Amid this growing tension, a dusty pickup truck with California plates pulled into Ethan's driveway late one afternoon. Shadow alerted with a low woof, but showed no aggression, just curiosity, as a lanky young man with familiar eyes stepped out. "Daniel," Ethan said, his voice catching on the name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. His son stood awkwardly by the truck, now 28 and bearing a striking resemblance to his mother. "Dad," he acknowledged with a stiff nod, "saw you on that national news segment about military dogs. Thought it might be time to visit." The conversation that followed was strained with 14 years of absence. They sat on the porch, two strangers connected by blood but separated by time and unspoken pain. Shadow, usually wary of newcomers, positioned himself between them, occasionally nudging Daniel's hand when the silence grew too heavy. "Mom said you came back different," Daniel finally said. "That you couldn't be around us anymore." Ethan flinched. "That's not ... entirely accurate. I wanted to come home. I just didn't know how to be the father you needed when I couldn't even recognize myself." "And now you're some kind of dog whisperer." There was an edge to Daniel's voice. "Saving dogs when you couldn't—" He stopped himself, but the unfinished accusation hung in the air. "When you couldn't save your family." "I'm just trying to help them heal," Ethan said quietly. "Maybe heal myself in the process." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "This Harrison guy who's after your dog, I looked him up. He's serious business, Dad. Military connections, private security contracts. You've made some powerful enemies. Are you doing this for the dogs or to make yourself some kind of hero?" The question stung with its hint of truth. Had he been seeking redemption through Shadow? Was this about justice or his own need to save something when he'd failed to save so much? "You should come see what we do," Ethan offered instead of answering, "before you decide what my motives are." The center was quiet when they arrived, most of the day's rehabilitation sessions complete. A young Marine with prosthetic legs was finishing a training exercise with a chocolate lab who had lost an eye in an IED explosion. The dog matched its pace perfectly to the Marine's gait, both of them moving with hard-won coordination. "That's Rick and Cooper," Ethan explained. "They've been working together for 6 months. When Rick first came, he hadn't spoken in over a year. Cooper had severe aggression issues from his trauma." Daniel watched in silence as the pair completed their circuit. "We're not making heroes here," Ethan said quietly. "We're just trying to help the wounded find their way back. Dogs, people, sometimes the path to healing is the same." As they drove back to the ranch, Shadow riding between them in the truck, Daniel spoke again. "They're really going to try to take him from you, aren't they? This Harrison and his military friends. Yes. And you're going to fight them. Ethan glanced at Shadow, who met his eyes with unwavering trust. With everything I have. Daniel nodded slowly. Then I guess I picked an interesting time to show up. Morning arrived with Daniel asleep on Ethan's couch, his presence both a comfort and a source of tension. Ethan watched his son's sleeping form, the man who had been a boy when he'd last truly known him. Shadow padded quietly to Daniel's side, sniffing curiously before settling on the floor beside him, as if appointed his guardian. He likes you, Ethan said when Daniel finally stirred. That's unusual. He's careful with strangers. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, looking so much like his mother it made Ethan's chest ache. Dogs have always liked me. Mom said I got that from you. The mention of Lisa, Daniel's mother, and Ethan's ex-wife hung between them. 14 years of silence had created a chasm neither knew how to bridge. She remarried, Daniel offered, accepting the coffee Ethan handed him. About 5 years ago, guy named Robert. Insurance executive. Nice enough. Ethan nodded, unsure what to say. He had forfeited any right to feelings about Lisa's life when he'd withdrawn into his PTSD after returning home. Are you in touch with your sister? Megan's in medical school now. Boston Daniel's answers were clipped, protective of the family Ethan had left behind. She doesn't talk about you much. I wouldn't expect her to. Ethan busied himself with breakfast preparations, the familiar routine a shield against emotions he wasn't ready to face. I wasn't there when she needed me. You weren't there when any of us needed you, Daniel said, the words lacking the heat of accusation, just stating a fact. Mom said you couldn't help it, that the war broke something in you. He paused, watching Ethan move around the kitchen. Did it? Ethan had faced enemy fire with less trepidation than his son's simple question. Yes, he finally said. But that's not an excuse, it's just what happened. And now you fix broken dogs. They fix me too, Ethan replied, nodding toward Shadow. It goes both ways. Over the next few days, an uneasy routine developed. Daniel observed the rehabilitation center's operations, keeping a careful emotional distance but absorbing everything. He watched Ethan work with a newly arrived Belgian Malinois that had been rescued from an abusive private security contractor, the dog snarling and lunging until Ethan's calm, steady presence gradually penetrated its fear. You're different with them, Daniel observed one evening as they drove home. Patient, present. Like nothing else exists. The unspoken comparison to his fatherhood hung in the air. I learned it too late, Ethan acknowledged. How to be present through the noise in my head. He glanced at his son. I know it doesn't change what happened, Daniel. I'm not expecting forgiveness. Then what are you expecting? Why did you let me stay? The question had no easy answer. Because you're my son, Ethan finally said. Because I missed 14 years I can't get back. Because maybe this fight I'm in isn't just about Shadow. Daniel said nothing, but Ethan noticed he patted Shadow's head more frequently that evening. Meanwhile, Sarah Baker was assembling an army of her own. The legal challenge to Shadow's status had unearthed a network of support they hadn't known existed. Veterans advocacy groups offered pro bono legal assistance. Former military handlers came forward with their own stories of Harrison's abusive methods. Journalists who had covered Shadow's story reached out, eager to follow this new development. We've got 6 affidavits from handlers who worked under Harrison, Sarah reported during a strategy session at the rehabilitation center, all confirming his methods violated military protocols. 3 veterinarians are willing to testify about injuries consistent with abuse in dogs from his program. Dr. Thompson added medical evidence to their growing arsenal. I've compiled Shadow's full medical history before and after rehabilitation. The physical and behavioral transformation is undeniable proof that Harrison's methods were not just cruel but counterproductive to creating effective working dogs. James Cooper had activated his own network of retired military personnel. Got some interesting intel, the old handler reported. Harrison's been rebuilding his operation through a private contractor called Sentinel Security. They're training dogs for overseas contracts, same abusive methods, just without military oversight. The veterans who had benefited from the rehabilitation program volunteered to testify about how their paired dogs had aided their own recovery from PTSD and physical injuries. Rick, the young Marine with prosthetic legs, was particularly adamant. That man tried to destroy these dogs' spirits just like the war tried to destroy ours. I'm not letting him win. Sheriff Davidson provided security updates, his concern growing with each report. Harrison's people have been spotted in town. 2 men in a black SUV parked near the center yesterday. They left when my deputy approached, but they'll be back. Through it all, Shadow maintained his role as the heart of the center, demonstrating remarkable resilience despite the growing pressure. He worked with new dogs, showing them by example how to trust again, how to overcome their trauma responses. But Ethan noticed subtle changes: Shadow sleeping lighter, reacting more strongly to unexpected noises, staying closer to Ethan's side. He knows something's happening, Ethan told Sarah as they watched Shadow guide a nervous German Shepherd through basic trust exercises. He senses the threat. Dogs always know, she agreed. The question is whether this legal battle is helping or hurting his recovery. You've spent 3 years helping him heal from trauma, and now Harrison is forcing him to relive it all. The question hit Ethan hard. Was he doing the right thing for Shadow, or was his determination to fight Harrison to expose the truth putting his partner through unnecessary suffering? That night, Shadow woke whimpering from what was clearly a nightmare, the first in months. He paced the bedroom, agitated and hypervigilant, unable to settle. Ethan sat on the floor, speaking quietly until Shadow finally approached, pressing against him with trembling muscles. "I've got you, buddy," Ethan whispered. "We're going to get through this." But doubt had taken root. Was continuing this fight truly in Shadow's best interest? Or was Ethan using Shadow to wage his own war against the system that had damaged them both? Daniel found him the next morning, still on the floor with Shadow curled against him, both finally asleep after the difficult night. "He had a rough night," Ethan explained groggily as Daniel set down a cup of coffee beside him. "Like your rough nights?" Daniel asked. There was no judgment in his voice, just recognition. "Mom said you used to wake up screaming, that sometimes you didn't know where you were." Ethan nodded, surprised by his son's perception. PTSD doesn't just go away. For either of us, he ran a hand along Shadow's flank. But we've learned to manage it together. This court case is bringing it all back for him, isn't it? Yes. Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor, creating a small circle with Ethan and Shadow. "When I was 14 and you came back from your last deployment, I used to hear you pacing at night. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. Mom said to leave you alone, that you needed space." The memory of those dark days made Ethan wince. She was trying to protect you. Maybe Daniel acknowledged. But I think what you needed wasn't more space. It was someone who understood without needing explanations. Someone who could just be there through it. He looked pointedly at Shadow, like he does for you now. The insight from his son, this man who had been a boy when Ethan's world shattered, was startling in its clarity. "When did you get so wise?" Daniel shrugged. "Psychology major. Plus, I've had 14 years to think about what went wrong with our family." That afternoon, they received word that the court hearing had been moved up. A judge would hear arguments in 3 days regarding Shadow's status. Harrison's legal team had filed for an emergency injunction to prevent Ethan from removing the asset from the jurisdiction while the case proceeded. "They're trying to rush this through," Sarah warned. "They know the longer we have to prepare, the more support we can gather." As the legal team prepared their arguments, Rebecca Collins escalated her campaign against the rehabilitation center. Flyers appeared around town warning of dangerous military dogs in the community. The local paper ran an opinion piece calling for stricter regulations on the center's operations, citing safety concerns. Ethan found one such flyer taped to his mailbox, featuring a snarling military dog with the caption, "Is this what you want near your children?" The dishonesty of the image, so contrary to the reality of their rehabilitated dogs, made his blood boil. "They're painting us as monsters," he told Daniel as they drove back to the ranch. "These dogs have survived hell, worked through their trauma, learned to trust again, and they're being portrayed as ticking time bombs." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said something unexpected. "Maybe we should let people see for themselves." "What do you mean?" An open house. Invite the community, especially the skeptics, to see what actually happens at the center. Let them meet the dogs, the veterans. See the real work instead of these fear-mongering fantasies. The idea was both brilliant and terrifying. Opening the center to the public meant risking confrontation, potential triggers for the more fragile dogs. But continuing to operate behind closed gates was feeding the community's fears. It's risky, Ethan admitted. But you might be right. People fear what they don't understand. That evening, they presented the idea to Sarah and the core team. After intense discussion about safety protocols and which dogs could handle public interaction, they decided to move forward. The open house would be scheduled for the day before the court hearing, a final push for community support before facing Harrison's legal challenge. As preparations for both the open house and court hearing intensified, Shadow's behavior continued to concern Ethan. The German Shepherd was increasingly alert, constantly patrolling the ranch perimeter. During training sessions, his focus remained impeccable, but in quiet moments, Ethan could see the strain in his partner's eyes. Dr. Thompson noticed too. He's protecting you, she observed during Shadow's weekly checkup. He knows you're under threat, and he's on guard duty. It's actually remarkable. Rather than regressing to fear responses, he's channeling his military training positively. But at what cost to him, Ethan asked. I look at him sometimes and see that haunted look coming back, the one he had when I first found him. That's the question only you can answer, she replied gently. Is this fight worth reopening old wounds? For both of you. The question followed Ethan through sleepless nights. Shadow's devoted presence, the way he positioned himself between Ethan and any perceived threat, his refusal to relax his vigilance, was both touching and troubling. The dog, who had finally found peace, was willingly returning to a war footing to protect his partner. Daniel, watching this dynamic unfold, became an unexpected ally. He took over some of Shadow's rehabilitation duties, allowing the dog brief respites from his self-imposed guard duty. In these quiet moments, Ethan saw his son's natural affinity with the traumatized animals, a gift he hadn't known Daniel possessed. You're good with them, Ethan remarked, watching Daniel successfully calm a newly arrived Labrador that had been frantically pacing its enclosure. They make sense to me, Daniel replied simply. Their pain is honest, no pretense, no hiding. The day before the open house, General Matthews made an unexpected visit to the ranch. Shadow's reaction was immediate, a low growl that Ethan had rarely heard since his early days at the ranch. Sorry to drop in unannounced, Matthews said smoothly, ignoring Shadow's clear disapproval. I wanted to check in before tomorrow's events. The Pentagon is following this case closely. Which side are you on? General Ethan asked bluntly. Matthews smiled thinly. I'm on the side of proper protocol, Walker. Military working dogs represent significant investments. Their disposition after service needs to follow established channels. Even when those channels lead to abuse and disposal of dogs that have served honorably. Allegations of abuse are exactly that, allegations. Major Harrison has maintained that his methods were within approved parameters. Shadow's growl deepened and Ethan placed a calming hand on his back. Shadow disagrees with that assessment, General, as do the medical reports documenting his injuries. Matthews glanced at Shadow with something like calculation in his eyes. Impressive animal. I can see why Harrison wants him back. Best tracker in the program, as I recall. The comment sent a chill through Ethan. How would Matthews know specific details about Shadow's abilities unless he had been closely involved with Harrison's program? Shadow isn't going anywhere, Ethan stated firmly. He's retired from service. This is his home now. As Matthews departed, Daniel emerged from the barn where he'd been observing the exchange. I don't trust that guy, he said flatly, the way he looked at Shadow, like he was assessing property. I don't trust him either, Ethan agreed. And neither does Shadow. That night, as final preparations for the open house were completed, Ethan sat with Shadow on the porch. The German Shepherd's head rested on his knee, but his eyes remained alert, scanning the darkness beyond the ranch lights. You know what's coming, don't you? Ethan murmured. You always could sense danger before anyone else. Shadow looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding, eyes that had seen battlefield horrors, endured abuse, and still somehow maintained the capacity for trust and loyalty. "Whatever happens in that courtroom," Ethan promised, "I won't let them take you. You've fought enough battles. This one's mine to fight." But as Shadow pressed closer against him, Ethan wondered if they had ever truly had separate battles. From that day in Afghanistan when Shadow had tried to warn his unit, to the auction house where Ethan had found him again, perhaps they had always been fighting the same war, seeking the same peace. And now, with Harrison's renewed threat, the community's fear, and the legal system's cold categorization of Shadow as property, they faced their biggest battle yet, not just for Shadow's freedom, but for recognition of the bond that transcended handler and military asset. A bond that had healed them both when nothing else could. The Helena Federal Courthouse stood imposing against the Montana sky, its granite steps crowded with protesters from both sides of the Shadow debate. Signs reading "Military heroes have 4 legs too" competed with others warning military dogs are not pets. News vans lined the street, evidence that Shadow's case had captured national attention. Inside courtroom 3, Ethan sat with Sarah and their legal team, Shadow's absence beside him feeling like a physical wound. The court had denied their request to have Shadow present during proceedings, citing security concerns that infuriated Ethan but didn't surprise him. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Eleanor Harmon entered. In her 60s, with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes, she had a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency and strict adherence to the letter of the law, which could be either helpful or devastating to their case, depending on how she interpreted military property statutes. Harrison's legal team projected confidence, led by Gregory Walsh, a former JAG officer now specializing in military equipment procurement disputes. The irony of handling Shadow's case with the same approach used for disputed helicopter parts wasn't lost on Ethan. "Your Honor," Walsh began after preliminary motions, "this case is straightforward. K-9 7421, known colloquially as Shadow, is military property allocated to the specialized training program headed by Major James Harrison. During a routine evaluation, the animal was temporarily housed at a county facility where Mr. Walker illegally acquired him without proper military authorization. The characterization of Shadow's abuse and abandonment as a routine evaluation made Ethan's jaw clench. Sarah placed a warning hand on his arm. "The military's position is clear," Walsh continued. "This animal represents a significant investment of taxpayer resources and specialized training. Mr. Walker has no legal claim regardless of his emotional attachment. We ask the court to order the immediate return of K-9 7421 to military custody for proper reassignment." Their own attorney, Meredith Chin, had been provided pro bono by a veterans advocacy group. She approached the bench with measured confidence. "Your Honor, this case is about much more than property rights. It's about our moral obligation to the animals who serve alongside our troops," she began. "The record will show that Shadow was not in a routine evaluation but had been classified for euthanasia after being subjected to documented physical abuse under Major Harrison's so-called enhanced training program." She methodically laid out the timeline: Shadow's distinguished service record, the irregular transfer to Harrison's experimental program, the abrupt reclassification as unstable, despite prior commendations, and finally the abandonment at a civilian auction house with injuries consistent with systematic abuse. "Mr. Walker didn't acquire military property," Chin emphasized. "He rescued a discarded veteran who had been left to die after his usefulness was deemed expired. The military had effectively abandoned any claim when they authorized his transfer to civilian authorities for disposal." Judge Harmon interrupted. "Counselor, while I appreciate the emotional aspects, we're dealing with legal definitions here. Military working dogs are classified as equipment under current Pentagon policy, despite recent legislation improving their treatment. What legal basis are you asserting for Mr. Walker's claim?" Chin nodded, prepared for this question. "3 legal grounds, Your Honor. First, the abandonment doctrine. The military relinquished ownership when they transferred Shadow to civilian authorities without proper retirement processing. Second, the recent Military Working Dog Treatment Act specifically requires humane retirement options for service dogs. And third, we have evidence that the documentation authorizing Shadow's disposal was fraudulently created to cover up abuse, making any transfer of ownership void." The morning proceeded with meticulous examination of documents, testimonies from veterinarians about Shadow's injuries, and statements from former handlers about Harrison's methods. Throughout, Ethan noticed Harrison himself sitting impassively behind his attorneys, occasionally making notes but never meeting Ethan's eyes directly. The court's clinical dissection of Shadow's suffering, reduced to exhibit numbers and medical terminology, made Ethan's blood boil. During the lunch recess, Daniel joined them in a small conference room. "How's it going?" he asked, handing Ethan a sandwich he wouldn't eat. "They're treating him like a broken Jeep," Ethan replied, his voice tight. "Military property to be allocated or disposed of according to protocol. Not one mention of his service, his sacrifice." "The community turnout is impressive," Daniel offered. "The open house yesterday changed some minds. Rebecca Collins' husband actually spoke to reporters in support of the center." The previous day's open house had indeed exceeded expectations. Over 300 community members had toured the facility, meeting the rehabilitated dogs and their veteran partners. The controlled demonstrations had shown the reality of their work: not dangerous animals, but healing partnerships. Even some of the most vocal critics had left with changed perspectives. Court reconvened with Harrison's team, calling their star witness, General Andrew Matthews. "General, can you explain your role in overseeing military working dog programs?" Walsh asked. Matthews presented an imposing figure in full dress uniform. "I oversee allocation of resources for specialized training programs, including the advanced techniques pioneered by Major Harrison." "And would you characterize these training methods as abusive?" "Absolutely not. Military working dogs require disciplined conditioning to perform reliably in combat situations. Major Harrison's methods produced exceptional results in field operations." Chen rose for cross-examination. "General Matthews, are you familiar with the military's own guidelines on humane treatment of working dogs?" "Of course." "Then perhaps you can explain these photos." Chen displayed a series of images showing Shadow's condition upon arrival at Dr. Thompson's clinic. "Do these injuries appear consistent with approved training protocols?" Matthews barely glanced at the images. Working dogs sustain injuries in training and deployment. Without context, these photos prove nothing. "What about this context?" Chen produced Baker's journal, now entered as evidence. Lieutenant Baker's documented concerns about Shadow's treatment, which he officially reported to his superiors. Reports that mysteriously disappeared from military records. But a flicker of discomfort crossed Matthews' face. Lieutenant Baker was not qualified to evaluate specialized training protocols. Yet he was qualified enough to lead men into combat with these dogs, Chen countered. "General, when did you first become aware of Major Harrison's enhanced training methods?" "I reviewed the program after its implementation." "So you were not involved in its development?" Matthews hesitated barely a second too long. "I provided general oversight, as with all programs under my purview." "Then you were aware that dogs showing independence or resistance were being classified as unstable and removed from service?" "Any working dog that cannot reliably follow commands presents a danger in combat situations." Chen approached with a final document. "Is this your signature authorizing the experimental use of enhanced stress techniques on select military dogs, including Shadow?" Matthews examined the document, his composure slipping momentarily. "This appears to be a preliminary authorization for testing potential training improvements." A test that resulted in dozens of dogs being abused, classified as unstable, and eliminated when they showed signs of trauma. Chen pressed. "A program you continued to support even after receiving documented concerns from field officers." "Objection, Your Honor," Walsh interjected. "Counsel is badgering the witness." Sustained. Judge Harmon ruled. "Move on, Ms. Chen." But the damage was done. Matthews' careful facade had cracked, revealing his deeper involvement in Harrison's program. As he stepped down, Ethan saw the general exchange a tense glance with Harrison, a silent communication that spoke volumes. The afternoon brought Ethan's testimony. He described finding Shadow at the auction, the dog's initial fear and aggression, the slow process of building trust, and finally the transformation as Shadow began helping other traumatized dogs. "He's not equipment, Your Honor," Ethan concluded, his voice steady despite his emotion. He's a veteran who served his country with honor, was betrayed by the system meant to protect him, and deserves the retirement with dignity that any soldier would expect. Harrison's attorney's cross-examination was designed to provoke. Mr. Walker, isn't it true that your interest in Shadow stems from your own failed military career? That you're using this dog to redeem yourself? Ethan took a measured breath. My military career ended with an honorable discharge after being wounded in action. There's nothing to redeem. My interest in Shadow is about justice and honoring a fellow veteran. A dog is not a veteran, Mr. Walker. It's military equipment that. The courtroom doors burst open, interrupting Walsh mid-sentence. Dr. Thompson rushed in, ignoring the bailiff's attempt to stop her. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but the court needs to see this. She handed documents to the clerk. These just arrived from the Pentagon Archives via FOIA request. They're the complete medical records for K9 7421 Shadow, including assessments from before Harrison's program claimed him. Judge Harmon reviewed the documents with narrowed eyes. These appear to contradict Major Harrison's claims about the dog's behavioral issues. His prior evaluations show exemplary performance and stable temperament until he was transferred to the enhanced training program. Walsh scrambled to regain control. Your Honor, these records haven't been authenticated. We object to their admission without proper verification. They bear official Department of Defense watermarks and serial numbers, Judge Harmon noted. The court will admit them pending verification, which I'm ordering expedited. As the new evidence was entered into record, a commotion arose outside the courtroom. The doors opened again, and James Cooper wheeled himself in, accompanied by Sheriff Davidson and Shadow. Your Honor, the sheriff said, I apologize for this unusual request, but given the new evidence and the nature of this case, Mr. Cooper believes Shadow's presence is vital to these proceedings. Judge Harmon frowned. This is highly irregular, Sheriff. So is putting a hero on trial as if he were a piece of equipment, Cooper replied bluntly. Shadow's not just the subject of this case, he's a witness to what Harrison did. The judge considered for a long moment. I'll allow it, with the understanding that at the first sign of any issue the dog will be removed. She addressed the bailiff. Please help Mr. Cooper position near the plaintiff's table. Shadow entered the courtroom with dignity that belied his status as property in the case. His eyes scanned the room with military precision until they locked on Harrison. A low growl emerged from his throat, but he remained at Cooper's side, controlled but alert. The effect on the courtroom was immediate and powerful. The abstract discussion of K9 7421 became concrete in the presence of the actual dog, not a piece of equipment, but a living being with evident intelligence and awareness. Harrison's reaction was equally telling. He visibly tensed, his hand instinctively moving to his pocket before stopping himself. Judge Harmon didn't miss the motion. Major Harrison, she said suddenly, approached the bench. Harrison did so reluctantly. This dog clearly recognizes you, and not favorably, she observed. Does he have reason to fear you specifically? Your Honor, military working dogs are conditioned to respond to handler authority. My training methods were designed to instill proper respect for the chain of command. That doesn't answer my question, Major. Harrison's composure slipped. The dog was resistant to proper discipline. Sometimes stronger measures were necessary to ensure compliance. Shadow's reaction to Harrison's voice was unmistakable, a mixture of fear and protective aggression that spoke more eloquently than any testimony. Judge Harmon turned to Ethan. Mr. Walker, please approach your dog. Ethan moved to Shadow's side, placing a gentle hand on his back. The transformation was immediate. Shadow relaxed, his attention shifting from Harrison to Ethan with absolute trust. The contrast is rather stark, Judge Harmon noted. One relationship based on fear, another on trust. She returned to the bench. I believe I've seen enough to render a decision, unless there are further witnesses. Your Honor, Chen interjected. We'd like to call one final witness who has just arrived, Captain Michael Reeves, formerly of Special Operations Command, who supervised missions where Shadow served before his transfer to Harrison's program. The testimony that followed delivered the final blow to Harrison's case. Captain Reeves detailed Shadow's exemplary service record. including the mission where Shadow had broken protocol to warn Ethan's unit action that saved lives but marked the beginning of Harrison's targeting of the dog. Dogs with that kind of independent judgment were dangerous to Harrison's program, Reeves explained. His methods required absolute compliance, not intelligent decision-making. Shadow showed too much initiative. As Captain Reeves finished his testimony, Judge Harmon called a brief recess to review all evidence before rendering her decision. During the 30-minute break, Ethan remained with Shadow, keenly aware that these might be their final moments together if the ruling went against them. Daniel joined them, crouching beside Shadow. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "we'll keep fighting. We won't let him take him." The certainty in his son's voice, the we that bound them together in common purpose after years of separation, nearly broke Ethan's composure. When Judge Harmon returned, the courtroom fell silent. Shadow sat alert between Ethan and Daniel, as if understanding that his fate hung in the balance. "This court has reviewed all evidence and testimony," she began, "and finds that this case represents a significant question about how we treat those who serve our nation, regardless of whether they have 2 legs or 4. Judge Harmon's ruling sent ripples through the military working dog community. She determined that Shadow had been effectively abandoned by the military when placed in the auction without proper retirement protocols, making Ethan's adoption legal. More significantly, she ordered an investigation into Harrison's training program and its oversight. The courtroom erupted in subdued celebration as Ethan knelt beside Shadow, burying his face in the dog's fur. "We did it, buddy. You're home for good." Outside, reporters pressed for statements while supporters cheered. The victory felt absolute until Sarah noticed the black SUV parked across the street, Harrison visible in the passenger seat, his expression cold with fury. "We should get Shadow out of here," she warned, eyeing the vehicle. "Harrison doesn't strike me as someone who accepts defeat gracefully." They decided to bypass the planned victory celebration in town, heading directly back to the ranch instead. The convoy of vehicles, Ethan's truck with Shadow, Daniel following in his pickup, and several supporters including James Cooper and Sheriff Davidson maintained radio contact throughout the drive. "Something doesn't feel right," Daniel said when they pulled into the ranch driveway. The property appeared untouched, but Shadow's behavior confirmed the unease. The German Shepherd stood rigid in the truck bed, hackles raised, scanning the tree line with military focus. Sheriff Davidson did a perimeter check while Ethan kept Shadow close. "Nothing obvious," the sheriff reported, "but that doesn't mean much. Harrison's people are professionals." "We'll keep watch tonight," Cooper decided. "I'll take first shift with some of the boys from the VFW." The night passed without incident, lulling them into a cautious optimism by morning. Perhaps Harrison had accepted the court's decision after all. Shadow seemed to relax as well, returning to his normal routine of perimeter checks with Ethan and training sessions at the center. The afternoon brought Rebecca Collins and her son Tommy, the boy who had been bitten by the stray dog, to the rehabilitation center. Her visit surprised everyone, especially after her vocal opposition to the facility. "I saw the court coverage," she explained awkwardly, and Tommy wanted to meet the famous Shadow. The boy, arm still bandaged from his encounter with the stray, looked at Shadow with unrestrained curiosity. "You're the dog from TV," Tommy said with the directness of children. "Mom said you were in the Army." Shadow regarded the child calmly from his position beside Ethan, displaying none of the anxiety he sometimes showed around unfamiliar people. "He was Ethan," confirmed. "Would you like to meet him properly?" The introduction was carefully managed, with Ethan guiding both Shadow and Tommy through appropriate interactions. The boy's initial nervousness gave way to delight when Shadow performed a few simple commands, culminating in a gentle high five with his paw. "He's not scary," Tommy announced definitively, looking up at his mother. "He's like a police officer, but a dog." Rebecca's tight expression softened. "I may have been ... hasty in my judgment," she admitted to Ethan. "Seeing him with Tommy, how controlled he is even with strangers, it's not what I expected." Their conversation was interrupted by the center's alarm system blaring to life. Ethan's phone buzzed simultaneously with a security alert. Motion detectors on the property's far boundary had been triggered. "Get inside," he instructed Rebecca and Tommy sharply, military training taking over. Shadow was already on alert, body tense and focused toward the disturbance. Sarah emerged from the office area, Security camera feed shows 3 men entering from the north boundary, she reported tersely. They're armed. Harris and Ethan guessed grimly. Call the sheriff, he turned to Daniel, who had appeared from the training area. Get everyone into the secure room. Follow protocol. The center had been designed with security in mind, reinforced doors, designated safe rooms, multiple exit routes. They had never expected to need these features, but Ethan's military paranoia, as Sarah sometimes teasingly called it, was proving prescient. As staff quickly moved clients and dogs to the secure central building, Ethan realized with horror that Tommy was no longer beside his mother. He was just here, Rebecca said, panic rising in her voice. Tommy. Tommy. A quick scan of the immediate area showed no sign of the boy. Shadow reacted instantly to the distress in Rebecca's voice, head swiveling as he processed the situation. Shadow, find Ethan commanded, using the search command they'd practiced countless times. The German Shepherd's training activated immediately, nose to the ground. He began tracking Tommy's scent away from the building and toward the northern boundary where the intruders had been spotted. Stay here, Ethan ordered the others, drawing the handgun he kept secured in the office. Daniel, with me. Father and son followed Shadow's purposeful tracking, moving quickly but cautiously through the property. The dog led them toward a small creek that marked the property's edge, where Tommy stood frozen at the sight of 2 men in tactical gear advancing toward him. There's the dog, one of them said, raising what appeared to be a tranquilizer gun. Boss said to take it alive if possible. What about the kid? The second man asked. Collateral. Not our problem. Shadow assessed the threat in an instant. Without hesitation, he charged forward, positioning himself between Tommy and the armed men. The first tranquilizer dart missed, thudding into a nearby tree. The second found its mark in Shadow's shoulder, but not before the dog had crossed half the distance to the intruders. Ethan and Daniel emerged from cover simultaneously. Federal property, Ethan shouted, weapon raised. Stand down. The confrontation happened in seconds. The men, recognizing they were outnumbered and identified, retreated toward a waiting vehicle beyond the tree line. One fired a parting shot, not a tranquilizer this time, but a real bullet that grazed Shadow's flank as he stood protectively over Tommy. Shadow Ethan rushed forward as the dog staggered, the combination of blood loss and tranquilizer taking effect. Tommy was unharmed but terrified, clinging to the wounded dog who had placed himself in harm's way. He saved me, the boy kept repeating as Daniel led him back toward safety. He jumped right in front of me. Ethan gathered Shadow in his arms, the dog's weight substantial but adrenaline making it manageable. Stay with me, buddy, he urged as Shadow's eyes began to lose focus from the powerful sedative. Just like before, we get through it together. Sheriff Davidson arrived with deputies as Ethan carried Shadow back to the center, where Dr. Thompson was already preparing the medical area. The tranquilizer dart still protruded from Shadow's shoulder, and blood seeped from the bullet graze along his ribs. Get me a blood sample first, Thompson directed as they placed Shadow on the examination table. I need to know what they used before I can counteract it. Shadow's breathing had grown labored, his powerful body unnaturally still except for occasional tremors. The sedative was clearly designed for large animals, possibly with additional compounds to ensure complete incapacitation. This isn't standard tranquilizer, Thompson announced after initial tests. It's mixed with something else, something designed to cause neurological disruption. Her voice held barely controlled fury. This wasn't meant just to sedate him. It was meant to permanently disable him if they couldn't recover him. The implications of Harrison's vindictiveness, his willingness to destroy Shadow rather than let him remain with Ethan, hit like a physical blow. Ethan stayed at Shadow's side as Thompson worked Daniel beside him in silent support. His vitals are dropping, Thompson reported, urgency edging her voice. The combination is suppressing his respiratory system. I need to flush it out before it causes permanent damage. Outside the medical room, Rebecca Collins stood with her son, watching through the window as the team fought to save Shadow's life. Tommy's face was streaked with tears, his small hand pressed against the glass. He jumped right in front of me, Mom, he repeated. He didn't even know me, but he protected me. Hours crept by as Thompson battled the unknown chemical cocktail racing through Shadow's system. Ethan refused to leave, talking continuously to his partner, reminding him of their journey, their victories, all the dogs still waiting for Shadow's unique guidance at the center. "You didn't survive Afghanistan, Harrison's abuse, and everything else just to let some cheap shot take you down," Ethan insisted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We've got more work to do, more battles to fight. I need you, buddy." But as night fell, Shadow's condition continued to deteriorate. The poison was designed to be untreatable, a final act of cruelty from a man who viewed the dog as property to be destroyed if not possessed. In the waiting area, the rehabilitation center staff and clients gathered in silent vigil. The dog sensed the gravity of the situation, remaining unusually quiet and attentive. Even those normally reactive or anxious seemed to understand that one of their own, their leader and healer, was fighting for his life. "Dad," Daniel said softly, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder, "you need to prepare yourself. Dr. Thompson is doing everything she can, but—" "No," Ethan cut him off. "Shadow's come back from worse. He's a fighter." But as midnight approached, even Ethan couldn't deny the grim reality. Shadow's powerful body was failing system by system, despite Thompson's desperate efforts to counteract the poison. The dog who had survived war, abuse, and fire might finally have met the one battle he couldn't win. In the darkest hour of Shadow's struggle, Sarah Baker burst into the clinic, clutching her laptop with shaking hands. Her face was pale with shock, her eyes wide with revelation. "I found something," she said breathlessly. "The files from Lieutenant Baker's computer. I've been trying to decrypt them for years. The attack activated some kind of failsafe, released the encryption." Ethan looked up from Shadow's side, exhaustion and grief etched into his face. "What are you talking about, Sarah?" She set the laptop beside Shadow's medical bed, as if the unconscious dog needed to bear witness to her discovery. "Mike wasn't killed by enemy fire in Afghanistan. The official report was falsified." Her voice broke. "He was shot in the back at close range with an American-issue weapon." The room fell silent, broken only by the beeping of Shadow's heart monitor. "The night before he died, Mike emailed his commanding officer about Harrison's program," Sarah continued. "He had compiled evidence of dog abuse, falsified training records, and misappropriation of military resources. Shadow was his key witness. The dog had started breaking conditioning, showing evidence of the mistreatment." Dr. Thompson looked up from monitoring Shadow's vital signs. "That explains why Harrison was so desperate to eliminate Shadow. He wasn't just a dog who wouldn't comply, he was evidence." Sarah nodded grimly. "Mike's last journal entry mentioned arranging to have Shadow transferred back to their regular unit away from Harrison's program. The next day, during a routine patrol, Mike was shot. The official report called it enemy fire. But his personal recording device, which was supposedly damaged beyond recovery, tells a different story." She played a brief audio clip. The quality was poor, but Lieutenant Baker's voice came through clearly. "Shadow's alerting to something behind us, not ahead. Harrison, what are you doing back here? You're supposed to be at base." The recording cut off with the unmistakable sound of gunfire. "He had Shadow with him that day," Sarah whispered. "After Mike was shot, Shadow disappeared for 12 hours. When he was recovered, he was immediately classified as combat stressed and transferred to Harrison's enhanced training program, where the real abuse began." Daniel, who had been silently watching Shadow's labored breathing, looked up sharply. "So Harrison murdered Lieutenant Baker to cover up his dog abuse program. That seems extreme, even for him." "It wasn't just about the dog," Sarah explained, pulling up additional documents. "Harrison's program was funneling millions in defense contracts to private companies where he and General Matthews held silent partnerships. They were billing the military for specialized equipment, training protocols, even pharmaceutical compounds supposedly for dog training." Sheriff Davidson, who had been coordinating the search for Harrison's men, entered in time to hear Sarah's revelation. "So we're talking about fraud, corruption, and murder, not just animal abuse." "And with this evidence," Sarah said, her voice strengthening with purpose, "we can finally get justice for Mike. For all of them." The sheriff immediately contacted federal authorities, setting in motion an investigation that would eventually uncover the full extent of Harrison and Matthews' corruption. But in the clinic room, with Shadow still fighting for his life, the broader implications felt distant compared to the immediate battle. "Sarah," Ethan said gently, "I'm so sorry about Mike, but right now he looked helplessly at Shadow." Dr. Thompson had been rapidly scanning Sarah's files. Wait, there's something here about the compounds Harrison was developing. She focused intently on a technical document. These chemical formulations, they match components in the toxin affecting Shadow. Harrison didn't just develop these for training, he created fail-safes in case the dogs ever needed to be neutralized. Is there an antidote? Daniel asked, hope edging into his voice. Not specifically, but knowing the exact compounds changes our approach entirely. Thompson moved with renewed purpose, adjusting Shadow's treatment protocol based on the new information. I know what we're fighting now. While Thompson worked to save Shadow, word of Harrison's deeper crimes spread rapidly through the community. Rebecca Collins, who had remained at the center with Tommy after the attack, took immediate action. Using her connections as school principal, she began calling parents, teachers, local business owners, activating a network that had previously been turned against the rehabilitation center. Ethan Walker and Shadow protected my son today, she told them. Everything I believed about those dogs was wrong. They need our help now. By dawn, the transformation was remarkable. The center's parking lot filled with community members bringing food, supplies, and offers of assistance. Local veterans who had hesitated to engage with the program arrived in force, creating a protective perimeter around the property. News crews that had come to cover the attack found themselves documenting an unprecedented community mobilization instead. Young Tommy became an unlikely spokesman, his bandaged arm now a badge of honor as he solemnly explained to reporters how Shadow had jumped between him and the bad men with guns. He got really sick because he saved me, the boy stated with the simple clarity of children. But Dr. Thompson is fixing him, and everyone's helping. Inside the clinic, Thompson's adjusted treatment began showing tentative results. Shadow's vital signs stabilized, not improving dramatically, but no longer declining. By mid-morning, he was breathing independently, though still unconscious. He's fighting, Thompson told Ethan and Daniel. The poison was designed to cause neurological damage, but his system is remarkably resilient. If he makes it through the next 12 hours, his chances improve significantly. As they maintained their vigil at Shadow's side, Daniel finally addressed the question that had been building since his arrival at the ranch. I need to ask you something, he said quietly to Ethan. All these years I thought you stayed away because you didn't care that your PTSD was more important than your family. But watching you with Shadow, with the veterans here, it's different than what Mom described. Ethan met his son's gaze. What did she tell you? That you couldn't handle being around us. That we reminded you of everything you'd lost. That you chose to be alone. The pain of these words was evident in Ethan's expression. I never chose to be away from you and Megan. The doctor said I was a danger to myself, maybe to others. My flashbacks were violent, unpredictable. I believe staying away was protecting you. From yourself. From becoming collateral damage to a war that followed me home. Ethan looked down at Shadow. Until Shadow, I never found a way back from that edge. He understood the darkness in a way no human could. He showed me how to fight through it, one day at a time. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Why didn't you tell us that? Why let us believe you just didn't want us? Because it was easier for you to be angry at me than afraid for me. Ethan's voice was rough with emotion. Your mother made the best choice she could for your safety and stability. I don't blame her for that. The honesty of this exchange, facilitated by Shadow's silent presence, even in his unconscious state, marked a turning point for father and son. As they waited for Shadow to fight his way back, Daniel found himself reevaluating the narrative that had shaped half his life. I want to help, he finally said. Not just with Shadow, but with all of this. He gestured to encompass the rehabilitation center and everything it represented. I've spent 14 years blaming you for walking away. Maybe it's time I stop running too. Outside the clinic window, they could see the gathering community. People who had once feared Shadow now rallying to support him. Veterans finding purpose in defending the center. Children making get-well cards for a dog who had become a local hero overnight. The alliance against Harrison had expanded far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Sarah's evidence was now in federal hands, with arrests pending. The poisoning attack, meant to destroy Shadow and demoralize Ethan, had instead catalyzed a movement that would eventually transform military working dog programs nationwide. As afternoon approached, Shadow's paw twitched. Then his eyes opened unfocused at first, but gradually finding and fixing on Ethan's face. "Welcome back, buddy," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. "I knew you wouldn't give up." Shadow's recovery unfolded gradually over the next 6 weeks, each small victory celebrated by an expanding circle of supporters. The first time he stood unassisted, Dr. Thompson documented it clinically in his medical record, but the tears in her eyes told a different story. When he finally walked a complete circuit of the rehabilitation center's grounds, a spontaneous cheer erupted from staff and visitors alike. The legal aftermath of Harrison's attack moved with surprising swiftness. Federal agents arrested both Harrison and General Matthews within days of Sarah's evidence being submitted. The corruption charges expanded beyond dog abuse to encompass fraud, misappropriation of military funds, and most significantly the investigation into Lieutenant Baker's death. Harrison's attempt to eliminate Shadow had backfired spectacularly, bringing scrutiny to every aspect of his operation. Shadow managed to accomplish from a hospital bed what years of investigations couldn't, Sheriff Davidson remarked during one of his regular visits. Harrison's empire is falling piece by piece. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 2 months after the attack, Ethan received official notification that all legal challenges to Shadow's status had been permanently dismissed. The Department of Defense issued a formal apology, along with new designation papers recognizing Shadow as a retired military working dog with distinguished service record. No longer property, but a veteran with rights. The document arrived with a Purple Heart Medal, a previously unheard of recognition for a military dog, acknowledging the injury Shadow had sustained protecting Tommy Collins. While not officially sanctioned through military channels, the medal came with a personal note from a high-ranking Pentagon official: "Some traditions need to evolve. Some heroes have 4 legs." The rehabilitation center transformed in the wake of Shadow's ordeal. What had been a local controversy became a national cause, drawing support from veteran groups, animal welfare organizations, and government agencies. Funding poured in, allowing for expanded facilities and additional staff. Most importantly, new legislation was introduced in Congress, informally called Shadow's Law, establishing comprehensive protection and retirement protocols for military working dogs. Rebecca Collins, once the center's most vocal opponent, became its most passionate community advocate. The school board unanimously approved her proposal for an educational partnership, bringing students to learn about service dogs and veterans issues. Young Tommy started a weekend volunteer program where children read to recovering dogs, a therapy that proved remarkably effective for animals struggling with human interaction. On a personal level, the most profound changes came within Ethan's own family. Daniel extended his visit indefinitely, revealing a natural talent for working with traumatized dogs. He moved into the ranch's guest cabin, establishing boundaries that respected their still healing relationship while allowing them to rebuild connections daily. "I called Megan yesterday," Daniel mentioned casually one evening as they sat on the porch, Shadow resting between them. "Told her what's really been happening here. She might visit during her next break from medical school." Ethan absorbed this with careful neutrality, not wanting to pressure but unable to hide his hope. "I'd like that," he said simply. Sarah Baker became a more permanent fixture at the ranch as well. The shared mission of honoring her husband's legacy by continuing his work created a bond with Ethan that evolved naturally into something deeper. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than dramatic passion. "Mike would approve," she said one evening watching Shadow and Ethan train a newly arrived Belgian Malinois. "He always said you were the best handler in the unit." 6 months after the court case, the Second Chance K9 Rehabilitation Center hosted a formal dedication ceremony. The expanded facilities now included a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic, specialized training areas for dogs with different needs, and comfortable housing for veterans participating in the residential program. At the center of the complex stood the Lieutenant Michael Baker Memorial Building, housing educational resources and research facilities dedicated to advancing trauma recovery techniques for both humans and animals. The ceremony drew hundreds of attendees, military officials, politicians, celebrities who had championed the cause, and most importantly, local community members who had witnessed the center's evolution firsthand. Shadow, fully recovered though with a slight limp that would likely be permanent, greeted visitors with dignified composure, every inch the distinguished veteran in his formal service vest adorned with the Purple Heart. 3 years ago, I found a broken dog at a county auction. Ethan addressed the crowd from the podium. Or maybe he found me, 2 wounded warriors who couldn't see a way forward. He glanced down at Shadow, sitting attentively at his side. What we discovered together was that healing isn't a destination, it's a journey. And it's one best traveled with companions who understand both the darkness and the light. The most powerful moment came when Tommy Collins and his mother unveiled the center's new sign, a striking image of Shadow in profile, alert and dignified, with the words "Second Chance K9 Rehabilitation Center, where unbroken spirits find their path home." As the formal ceremonies concluded, Ethan found a quiet moment alone with Shadow at the edge of the property, looking out over the Montana landscape that had become their sanctuary. The German Shepherd's once dull coat now gleamed in the afternoon sun, his bearing proud despite the visible scars that would always mark his journey. "We did it, buddy," Ethan said softly, one hand resting on Shadow's head. "All of it. Baker would be proud." Shadow leaned against his leg with the comfortable pressure that had become their silent language of trust and connection. His dark eyes, once haunted by trauma, now held the calm wisdom of a warrior who had found his peace without forgetting his path. Daniel approached, giving them space but joining their contemplation of the view. "The first group of dogs from the expanded program are arriving next week," he said. 5 German Shepherds, 3 Belgian Malinois, and that Labrador from Texas. "You ready for that?" Ethan asked, noting with quiet pride how naturally his son had stepped into a leadership role at the center. "We're ready," Daniel corrected, including Shadow in his assessment. "The old-timers will help the newcomers find their way. Isn't that how it always works?" Sarah joined them, bringing news that federal prosecutors had added new charges against Harrison based on evidence from his seized records. Justice for Lieutenant Baker and all the dogs who hadn't survived Harrison's program was finally within reach. As twilight settled over the ranch, they walked back toward the main buildings where lights glowed warmly against the gathering dusk. Veterans chatted on the porch while their canine partners rested nearby. Staff prepared the facility for tomorrow's training sessions. Volunteers organized supplies donated by the community. The scene embodied everything Shadow and Ethan had built together, not just a rehabilitation center, but a community founded on understanding that wounds, visible and invisible, need not define a life, but that broken spirits could become unbreakable when bound together by compassion, purpose, and the unique bond between humans and the animals who serve alongside them. Shadow paused at the threshold, looking back at the territory he had protected through both battle and recovery. Then, with the quiet confidence of a mission completed, he stepped inside, not as military property, not as a rescued animal, but as a veteran coming home. In life's twilight years, Shadow and Ethan's journey reminds us that our scars, whether from Vietnam, Afghanistan, or the private battles we fought, don't define our worth. Their story speaks to what many of our generation understand, that healing isn't about erasing the past, but finding purpose through it. Like Shadow, some of us were designated as damaged goods after our service, our trauma dismissed as weakness. But true strength lies in vulnerability and reaching through our pain to help another wounded soul find their way home. The family we build in our later years may not be the one we started with. It might include those who understand our unspoken battles, who recognize our service without needing explanations. It might be found in unexpected places with companions who see our true value when others look away. Remember Ethan's words, healing isn't a destination, it's a journey. No matter our age, our past, or our wounds, second chances await when we have the courage to extend our hand or paw to another who's struggling alongside us. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.